I remember the clink of porcelain first. A long table dressed in white linen, plates of steaming broth and cheap wine poured too generously so my father could boast of his open hand. He did this every Sunday, gathered us all, daughters pressed shoulder to shoulder like lined-up dolls, sons brimming with smug laughter they learned from him. Mother only ever watched, eyes low, spoons circling her soup as if the swirl could keep her invisible. I was 19 that winter. My dress was a hand-me-down from my sister's wedding, lace yellowed under my collarbones. I felt the cold of it on my wrists when I lifted my hands, as if the fabric itself disapproved of the girl wearing it. He cleared his throat, loud enough to hush the table. A small, battered box appeared from his pocket. He tossed it carelessly into my soup plate. A thin splash. A stain on white linen no one would wash for me. "Open it," he said. His voice was a kind of slap, the sort that doesn't bruise skin, but bruises softer places you never show. Inside, the ring was dull gold, too big, too old, a promise recycled like a curse. "He's good enough for you," my father announced, slicing his meat. "You won't do better. Quiet boy, cheap taste, suits a quiet, useless girl." Laughter. My brothers raised their glasses to the insult. My mother's spoon kept turning. No one met my eyes. I remember the taste of my breath, bitter and metallic, like I'd bitten my own tongue to keep from speaking. I slipped the ring on my finger that night, alone in the dark at my window. It spun loose on my knuckle, a circle too wide for my hand, but just right for my plan. I thought, if I must wear this, let it be my secret knife. Let it remind me not to stay small. Outside, snow gathered on the steps like a hush. Inside, I turned the ring 3 times, pressed it to my palm, and whispered a promise no one would hear until it was too late. He was waiting for me the next morning, the boy they'd called good enough. I found him in my father's yard, one boot in the snow, the other tapping out a nervous rhythm on the old stone path my grandfather once laid by hand. His name was Jonah. They never asked if I liked it. He held his hat in his hands like a prayer, head bowed, shoulders too narrow for the weight my family was about to hang on them. I stepped out, the cold biting through my sleeves. He looked up. Our eyes met, and I knew then he wasn't what my father thought. His gaze didn't slide past me the way my brothers did. He looked into me, the part of me I had learned to fold small under my ribs. A softness. A question. A secret, maybe. "Do you want this?" he asked, so quiet I almost pretended not to hear. The yard was silent except for the drip of melting frost from the eaves. Inside, I could hear my father's voice through the thin walls, telling my mother what colors I'd wear, what name I'd answer to next. I should have lied to Jonah. Should have said yes like a good girl says yes with her chin down and her hands clasped neat. But I only said the truth. "I don't know yet," I breathed, so my father wouldn't hear. "But I will, if you let me." He reached for my hand then, gloveless, his fingers warm against my cold knuckles. A touch too gentle for a girl who'd already begun to sharpen her edges. His thumb traced the loose ring, spun it once. "Then we wait," he whispered. "Until you know." The wind slipped between us, carrying his warmth away, but not before it left something behind. A flicker. A seed under winter earth. Inside, my father's voice rose again, barking orders at my mother like a drunk king at a quiet queen. I slipped my hand into Jonah's pocket instead of my own coat. I thought, maybe I'll say yes. But only to the part of him that knows how to hold quiet things without breaking them. I didn't know yet that I would build an empire in that pocket. Only that I liked the way he didn't flinch when I slipped my cold fingers under his ribs and listened for a heartbeat steady enough to carry us both. By spring, the wedding was stitched together with borrowed lace and cheap wine, the same vintage my father bragged over at Sunday dinners, watered down so it would stretch across too many mouths. They pinned flowers in my hair like a crown I hadn't asked for. I stood at the altar with Jonah's hand brushing mine, his thumb tracing the inside of my wrist where the skin was thin and honest. He did not smile too wide. He did not promise forever in loud, foolish ways. He only leaned in, his breath grazing the shell of my ear as the priest spoke of vows and debts. "It's only walls, you know," he murmured, so soft only I could hear. "What they're building for us. We can build our own inside it." I should have felt trapped, but his words painted windows where my father's voice had nailed them shut. When the last toast was drunk and the last laugh forced out of me like stale breath, Jonah found me in the empty hall. The ring sat heavy on my finger now, a circle that still didn't quite fit, but held steady under his touch. He led me to the small house my father gave him as a joke, for rooms, cracked tiles, a roof that wept in every storm. They called it a start, but meant it as an end. Inside, Jonah pressed me gently to the cold wall, one hand braced above my head. He kissed me like he was tasting the promise he'd whispered in the yard that winter, soft at first, then deeper, the slow press of his chest against mine warming the chill in my bones. He tasted of hope, of cheap wine and stubborn dreams, of the first brick we'd lay in the paper house they thought they'd built for us. "If you want to run, run now," he whispered against my mouth. I tipped my head back, his breath trailing down my throat like a vow. "No," I said, pulling him closer by the collar he'd worn to please my father. "We don't run. We stay. We build." His lips curved into a smile I felt more than saw, the kind of smile you can hide behind locked doors while the world laughs on the other side. Outside, the roof dripped. Inside, we made promises that would outlast the leaks and the mold and my father's poisoned blessing. When he lifted me, his hands were careful, guiding, claiming nothing but the right to stand beside me when the walls we raised would be ours alone. And as sleep found us tangled in that cold, cracked room, I dreamed not of escape, but of deeds, contracts, doors. I dreamed of paper that turned into brick, of laughter turned to silence, of keys heavy in my palm. The first winter in that crumbling house taught me the cold could be an ally. Jonah worked days at the mill and nights at the books, ink smudged on his fingertips like bruises that wouldn't wash off. I watched him at the kitchen table, a rickety thing my father had laughed at when he dropped it off with the house key, saying, "It'll do. Not like you'll ever eat much more than scraps anyway." I learned the ledger before I learned the stove. I traced columns of numbers under Jonah's patient eyes, the flame of the oil lamp flickering over his smile, that small, steady curve of pride that no one had given me before. In those nights, I realized power is a quiet thing, not in the slap of a father's voice or the slam of a door, but in the hush of coins counted twice, in the curl of my fingers around a pencil, rewriting what had been written for me. Sometimes, he'd reach for my hand across the ledger, his touch rough from the mill but warm as a hearth. His thumb would brush my knuckles, linger at the soft pulse inside my wrist, as if he was checking to make sure I was still there, still choosing this. "We could leave," he'd whisper when the numbers didn't add up yet. "One train, one bag, just us." But I would shake my head and smile back at him, a smile my father would never see coming. "Not yet," I'd say, voice soft as the coal ash drifting from the mill. "We stay. We gather. We make the walls ours from the inside out." He'd nod, press a kiss to my palm, a promise sealed in warmth and ink stains. By spring, the ledger balanced in my favor. By summer, I learned how to buy what I needed without my father's name. By fall, my mother sent a letter, slipped under our door when she thought no one would see. A scrap of paper, a trembling line of ink. "Tell me how you did it. Tell me how you stay warm in a house so cold." I folded it small and hid it in the ledger. One secret tucked into another. Outside, the leaves fell in silent apology for trees that never asked permission to grow tall. Inside, Jonah laid his head in my lap on nights when the world seemed too loud for him. I'd comb my fingers through his hair, soft and dark, whispering, "We stay. We build. We wait. And when the door opens, it opens for us alone." By the second winter, the cold no longer bit through my skin, it sharpened me instead. Jonah and I tended our house like a garden no one thought could grow. He patched the roof with tar and stubborn prayers, while I patched our future with contracts and small, hidden promises. My father's voice still reached us sometimes, carried by my brothers who came to sneer, to remind Jonah what he wasn't. They brought cheap ale and loud laughter, dropping muddy boots on our clean floor like they owned the dirt and the boards alike. I let them. I poured their drinks, I laughed when they laughed. I let their words sink into my skin like tiny thorns, each one a needle I'd stitch into something stronger. One night, as the snow stacked itself against our windows, I found Jonah at the door after they'd gone, hands braced on the frame, shoulders slumped under words that weren't his. I pressed my front to his back, arms slipping around his ribs. I felt the slow rise and fall of him, the hidden quake he never showed my family. "I'm not enough for them," he said, voice low, rough like gravel under soft snow. "Good," I whispered into the nape of his neck, my lips tracing the edge of his skin where his hair met his collar. "You're not theirs to measure." He turned then, slow, careful, and caught my face in his hands. His thumbs brushed the edge of my jaw, his breath warm in the cold space between us. "And for you?" he asked, a tremor beneath the question. I didn't answer with words. I rose on my toes, kissed the question from his mouth, tasting the salt of a man trying so hard to hold himself small. His hands slipped to my waist, fingers pressing in just enough to remind me he was real, here ours. I pressed closer until the cold door at my back gave way to the heat of him, the slow, deliberate claim of a man who knew he was building something no one could tear down. When we parted, I left my forehead against his, our breath mingling, soft clouds in the winter dark. "They'll come back," he said, voice steadier now. "Let them," I answered, tracing his pulse with my thumb. "Next time, they'll knock. Next time, they'll beg." In the quiet, he laughed, not loud like my father's echo, but deep, warm, a promise. Outside, the wind howled at the door it could no longer open. Inside, we wrote the next invitation, not on paper, but on skin, on breath, on the hush of our bodies pressing together like bricks against a storm. Spring returned with mud and rumors. By then, our little house no longer wept in storms. Jonah's hands had sealed every crack. My ink had sealed every debt. I spent mornings at the market, where the same women who once clucked their tongues at my father's poor mistake now lingered by my stall for my recipes, my small jars, my quiet words that somehow grew value the way seeds grow fruit. Jonah met me there some evenings, his work clothes dusted with sawdust from jobs my father would never admit he needed him for. He'd lean against the cart while I counted coins, the back of his hand brushing my hip, his thumb hooking the edge of my apron as if to say, "This is ours." They don't see it yet, but they will. One afternoon, word came folded into gossip. My father's factory had debts he'd hidden under my brother's pride. They drank too loud to notice the roof caving in. They laughed too hard to hear the silence where his gold used to be. When I told Jonah, he only nodded, eyes flicking to the ledger on our table. "The walls are thin now," he said, voice soft as a blade. "They'll knock soon enough." That night, my mother came first, her knock softer than the wind. I opened the door to her quiet apology, the lines on her face deeper than I remembered. She did not ask for warmth. She asked for space, a chair by the fire, a corner of my quiet to borrow for a night. Jonah poured her tea without asking. He kissed my temple as I watched her hands shake over the chipped cup. "They don't know you yet," she whispered when he stepped away. "No," I said, brushing a crumb from her lap. "But they will." When she left before dawn, she took nothing but the warmth she'd borrowed and left behind a whisper of what would come next. Jonah found me at the window after she was gone. His palm slid over my hip, warm, steady. His mouth pressed to my shoulder, teeth grazing skin where cloth fell loose. "They'll come for you soon," he said, voice muffled by the curve of my neck. I turned, cupped his jaw, kissed the last of his doubt from his lips. "No," I said, slow, certain. "They'll come to me. And when they do, we open the door on our terms." Outside, the first storm of the season rattled the shutters. Inside, his hands reminded me whose house this truly was, each touch a promise that the walls would hold, that the roof would not break. And in the hush between thunder and dawn, I laid my head on his chest and let the storm gather. Summer arrived, thick with heat and secrets that couldn't stay buried in dusty ledgers anymore. One evening, I heard their boots on our steps, heavier than my mother's soft apologies, louder than the quiet pride Jonah wore like a second skin. My father's voice reached the door before his hand did. "Open up. Don't make me ask twice." Jonah didn't flinch. He looked at me, a question he didn't need to speak. I pressed my palm to his chest, feeling his heartbeat drums steady beneath my fingers. "I'll answer it," I said, voice calm as still water. When I opened the door, my father filled the frame like a storm cloud, wide shoulders, sharp eyes that scanned our small, clean rooms as if weighing every scrap of furniture against his disappointment. Behind him, my brothers leaned on the porch rail, spitting seeds into the garden Jonah and I had planted from nothing. "So," my father said, voice thick with mock surprise, "the little house still stands. And you still stand in it. For now." I stepped aside without a word, letting him see the hearth that never went cold, the table set for two, but able to hold more if we wished. Jonah stayed back by the fireplace, his shirt sleeves rolled, sawdust still clinging to his arms. He met my father's eyes only once, and in that glance, something old and brittle cracked. "Speak your piece," I said, folding my hands at my waist the way my mother once taught me, the pose of a girl who pretends she's small, so no one notices she's not. "You'll come home," my father said, flicking his fingers at the house like it was dust on his coat. "You've had your rebellion. Now come home where you belong. Help your brothers fix what you broke." Behind him, my eldest brother barked a laugh, the same laugh he'd used when I spilled soup as a child, the same one he'd used when he pushed Jonah into the mud that first winter. I looked at my father's outstretched hand. Rough, cracked, trembling just enough for me to see he needed this more than he'd ever admit. "This is my home," I said. "You're standing in it." His jaw twitched. "Your name is still ours. Don't think this," he waved at the fire, the walls, Jonah's steady silence, "means anything. Blood is blood." Jonah stepped forward then, his hand brushing mine, a single warm line drawn between my pulse and his. "You're right," I said, lifting our joined hands so they could see. "Blood is blood. But I've learned how to make my own." I watched my father's eyes fall to our clasped hands, the calluses of Jonah's palm against the ink stains on my fingers. A new family. A quiet rebellion written on skin instead of stone. He tried to speak, but the words slipped like loose coins from an empty purse. "If you stay," I said softly, "you'll eat at our table. You'll warm your hands by our fire. And when you leave, you'll remember whose door you knocked on." Behind me, Jonah's thumb traced slow circles on the inside of my wrist, a reminder that power is gentle until it isn't. My father stepped back. My brothers' laughter dried in their throats. And in the hush that followed, I closed the door, slow and soft, a quiet latch that sounded like thunder. Inside, Jonah kissed my knuckles, a king's seal on a quiet queen. Outside, their boots crunched down the steps, leaving our garden untouched this time. When they left, the house hummed with something alive. Jonah and I sat by the fire, knees touching under the table where my ledgers lay open like old wounds healing in plain sight. He traced the ink with his thumb, lines of numbers, columns of quiet power no one saw but us. "He'll come back," Jonah said, voice low, heat flickering in the way he leaned closer like the flame, like the promise in his hands on mine. "Good," I murmured, resting my cheek against his shoulder. "He'll come back needing what we already own." The debt was larger than gold. It was my father's pride, my brothers' names inked beside loans they'd mocked me for once, small sums grown into chains when no one was watching. I'd bought their debts the way I bought our roof, our garden, our warmth. Quietly, bit by bit. A signature here, a favor there. A whisper in the right ear when their creditors wanted blood instead of promises. I could feel Jonah's smile where his lips brushed my hair. "Does it weigh heavy on you?" he asked. I turned my face to him, pressed my mouth to the hollow of his throat, where I could taste the salt of a man who carried burdens without complaint. "Not heavy," I breathed against his skin. It holds me up. He drew back just enough to look at me, eyes dark, soft, filled with the storm we'd built brick by quiet brick. When he kissed me then, it was no soft hush, but a claiming, his palms sliding down my arms, gathering me to him like a promise made flesh. The warmth of his hands slipped beneath linen and bone, tracing the dip of my spine, the slope of my hips where they fit against his as if the world had shaped us for this. The flicker of the fire danced over our skin, painting us in gold and shadow. "This debt," he murmured, his breath a vow on my collarbone, "it's yours. But I'll guard it like it's mine." I answered with my mouth, my hands, the soft gasp of my name lost in the hush between our joined bodies. Outside, the wind rose, but inside, there was only the heat of his touch, the steady rhythm that said, "We owe them nothing. They owe us everything." By dawn, the ledger was closed. But our bodies wrote new pages in the hush before sunlight, lines of quiet power inked into skin, signed in salt and breath. And in that softest of silences, I knew, when they came knocking again, they would not find a door. They would find me. When they returned, they did not come as thunder, they came as beggars. My father first, hat in hand, pride tucked behind trembling lips that once shaped my shame. He stood at our threshold, the same feet that had once kicked Jonah from the steps now rooted like weeds in our garden's neat path. I watched him from the window before I opened the door. Behind me, Jonah leaned in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, eyes calm. A silent guard, a reminder, I was not alone in this house I had built with calloused hands and quiet nights. "Daughter," my father said, voice cracked like old paint. "There are papers that need settling. Accounts, your brother's." He would not meet my eyes. They darted over my shoulder, searching for a crack in my walls, a softness to creep through. I stepped aside, not to invite him in, but to let him see it all. The warmth he had not built. The roof he never paid for. The man at my back who never flinched. "Sit," I said, pointing to the chair nearest the fire. He lowered himself like an old dog remembering a master's hand, unsure if he'd be fed or struck. I laid the papers before him. Neat. Signed. Debt bought cheap, but paid in full by my silence. "You owe me," I said softly, the words warm as the hearth. "You owe us." His mouth worked, a protest, a plea, an excuse caught in the dry well of his throat. I did not give him room to beg. Jonah moved behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder, a weight that anchored, that blessed. "You'll sign these lands over," I said. "The factory, the fields, the house you told me I'd never inherit." His eyes snapped up, the old fire there for a heartbeat, dying as quickly as it sparked. "You wouldn't take your own father's roof," he croaked. "You gave me none to start with," I reminded him, voice velvet and iron both. "So I built my own. And now I build yours again under my name." I lifted his hand, rough, cracked, trembling, and placed the pen between his fingers. His eyes flicked to Jonah. My husband only inclined his head, calm, watchful. The blade sheathed in warmth. When the pen scratched paper, it sounded like rain after drought. I watched him sign away the bones of his empire, piece by piece, letter by letter, until the ink ran dry and his shoulders sagged. When it was done, I laid my hand over his, not gentle, but final. "You will stay warm," I told him. "You will eat. You will grow old under my roof. But you will never again raise your voice in it." His eyes watered, whether with rage or relief, I never cared to know. Jonah's hands found mine when I stepped back, his thumb brushing my knuckles, sealing the last signature like a kiss. "It's done," he murmured against my hair. Outside, the garden he once trampled bloomed wild and wide. Inside, the fire crackled. The old king had fallen. And in the hush of his ruin, I felt no cruelty, only the quiet, ruthless mercy of a daughter who remembered everything. After the last page was signed and the door closed behind him, silence settled in, not cold, but clean. It drifted through the hallways he once filled with thunder, now echoing soft under my bare feet. I found Jonah in the garden at dawn, sleeves rolled, hands deep in the soil that fed us better than his kingdom ever did. When he saw me, he straightened, dirt on his palms, warmth in his eyes that never asked for permission to stay. "It's done then?" he asked, brushing the earth from his skin. I nodded, and he reached for my wrist, pulling me gently until I stood between rows of early blooms, the sun cresting behind my shoulder. His hands found my face, tracing the soft line of my jaw, the small, secret place below my ear where my pulse fluttered like a bird. "You look like peace," he whispered. "I feel like it too," I said, pressing my cheek into his palm. He bent his head and kissed me there, where my throat gave way to collarbone, a kiss like a seal pressed into wax, warm and final. His breath stirred the curls at my temple when he murmured, "And now?" I looked over his shoulder, past the rows of vegetables and herbs, past the walls that no longer held ghosts, only our laughter stitched into stone. "Now I grow what they could never keep alive," I told him. "Now I build a roof no one can be cast from." Jonah's hands slid down my arms, fingertips grazing skin where linen slipped away, quiet, reverent, deliberate. In the hush of the garden, his mouth found mine, slow, tasting of earth and promise. When he pressed me to the soft soil, flowers brushed my hair. He kissed the hush into my throat, the promise into my skin, his palms warm on my hips, his weight an anchor I had chosen freely. We moved together there, where nothing watched but the sun and the seeds we'd sown, the rhythm of our bodies a new inheritance written in sighs and open sky. When I rose, breathless and crowned in sweat and petals, I felt the hush of victory curl around my ribs like something alive. No fireworks. No witnesses. Just the slow burn of revenge turned to sanctuary. A house paid and debts returned. A father's pride traded for silence. A daughter's name, once spat like poison, now spoken only in the hush of soft gardens and warm nights. "We are free," Jonah whispered into my hair. And in the hush that came after, I knew I would never bow in that house again. Because the house bowed to me.